Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at calligraphic and implied lines. These types of lines can be used for many things, spatial depth and distance, but let's just talk a little bit about line and flat line first. So here you can see a flat line image. All of this is just in pretty much the same type of line throughout. Whereas this one is at least changing the thickness. As you see here, it's thicker and darker in the foreground, and then thinner and lighter as it goes to the background. And if you squint your eyes and look at it, it really feels as though it's moving your eye like this through the picture plane, whereas this one all feels just flat right on the front of the picture plane, not creating any depth at all. In these two images, in this one, you can see they're not really using calligraphic lines in very few places. They might have a few, but for the most part they only have two line widths. You have this heavy dark one, and then you have the lighter, thinner, normal flat line. And they're two flat lines. And so it feels very choppy when you look at the whole picture overall. It feels very choppy, whereas this one you actually get pulled in places, and this is using calligraphic line and also calligraphic line in spatial depth, lighter as it goes back in space, darker as it's closer, and wider calligraphic lines as it's closer to your viewer, So it's bringing your eye to different places within the compositional field. Calligraphic line in general is a gradual and tapering line. And it does have a tendency, when you have a thinner line, to feel like it's further away, and a thicker line to feel as though it's closer. And here you can see, we've talked about cross contour a little bit, and here you can see somebody really making use of the cross contours being thicker in places, wider and further apart, but also thicker and then gradually thinner as they come to the bodice of the cup. And it's really making the cup feel as though this is the part that's more rounded and more dimensional. And then here tapering in proximity. Remember we talked about proximity and the value lines. And here you're seeing the proximity of those lines getting very close together and moving and undulating over the form. And again, calligraphic line thinner and then thicker as it comes this way, and lighter and thicker and thinner, thinner to thicker and lighter to darker as it goes across there. And the same thing's happening up here to really get this to turn that form there. So you can use calligraphic lines in a way to really create a lot of physical dimension and also value. You're seeing value happen here. Relative proximity here is very close, and so it feels like this is actually darker in value. So if we look at these two types of lines here, you can see this is all just done in flat line. It's not very interesting to look at. It's pretty boring, truthfully. I mean, it's a nice line compositionally, but you know, it doesn't have any kind of variation or interest. In this one, you're noticing that it goes from very thick, and it's gradually tapering, and getting very thin, and then coming back and tapering very thick again. And this spot is really creating an interest viewer-wise because it feels like it's so far back in space, even though it's not really. And you can utilize these concepts in your contour line drawing. If you have calligraphic lines, lines that have darkness and then thinness and move and taper and become gradual, you'll be able to actually create more effective compositions that have a sensitivity to the line and shows value and stuff like that. Now, calligraphic lines come from the concept of calligraphy, and you'll notice that lots of tattoo artists and also designers use all sorts of calligraphic lines in the things that they create. Graphic illustration artists use their work in graphics. Artists, as well as designers of any kind, pretty much anybody who uses line will prefer the calligraphic lines because they have more depth and dimension to a flat, right on the surface of the picture plane kind of line. So good tattoo artists can do both, and that's kind of what you're looking for when you're also a graphic designer and a graphic novelist. So if we look at these three flowers, you'll notice that this one's very flat. It doesn't have any kind of depth to it at all, even though this petal is overlapping this petal, etc. It's very strong and staid and feels very formal. This one is also pretty much flat line. There's very few calligraphic or line changes in here at all. But this one is the most dimensionally drawn flower because this leaf is actually physically, or this petal, is coming towards you in space really dramatically. And this is really foreshortened as it goes back in space this way. So that's the most dimensional of the flowers. But when we look, this one being very flat and bold, we look at that one, we kind of forget this one altogether. And then we come to this one because it has variation of value. And we actually move around this one eye-wise a lot more than we do any of the other flowers. This one we see in 2 seconds, we don't care anymore. This one we don't even look at hardly, and then this one we're like, oh, this is kind of interesting, and we end up being more aligned in all of these calligraphic lines that are in here. We're more interested in those automatically, visually. Good artists know that, and they utilize that in their contour drawings. So here's a contour drawing done in pencil of garlics. And you can see there's a lot of variation in the calligraphic lines that are in here, and also in the lightness and darkness of those lines and where they get heavy and closer in proximity. And you know how garlics have all those little weird striations and stuff in the skin? And they're really actually showing all of that, and it feels very real and dimensional when we look at it. So if we look at calligraphic lines, can also kind of tell a story. So here we have 2 pregnant women. This is done in flat line and pretty boring to look at. It's not much. Whereas this one's very elegant. It does seem that the calligraphic lines bring our eye down to the weight of the pregnancy that's down here. Look how heavy this is. Just through the line, they're telling you that story in a visual way. That pregnancy is weighty and dimensional, and that this is the emphasis and important part right here of what this picture is telling you about. It's not about this woman, it's about this pregnancy. And so if you're a good artist, you utilize those things to your advantage. So here we have an artist who does some changes of line. Not really that much calligraphic line in here. It's mostly, for the most part, really heavy line in the foreground, lighter lines as it comes up and further away. So they're creating spatial distance and depth, but they're really not showing any kind of sensitivity to the line itself. You want to really integrate your lines throughout, and you'll notice that this one's really moving your eye around in the calligraphic line usage. And we are feeling that this is really draped and that those are the heavy weights of the fold, whereas here they feel very graphic, and they don't feel natural. So here we have another example of calligraphic lines, and they're primarily only using the calligraphic lines here on the exterior contours. There's very few interior contour calligraphic lines in here. There are a few, but not a whole lot. Here it's all flat line. Nothing but flat line. And you'll notice that this is more interesting to look at just because of those variations and changes. But you do want to integrate from the exterior to the interior as you're looking at some of the calligraphic lines. This heavier line right here coming from both of those and then getting lighter as it comes around is starting to really make that cross contour of that indentation or nadir feel dimensional. So you want to pay attention to those kind of things. Here's 2 beautiful drawings by students, and you'll notice that this one's very graphic. It has beautiful calligraphic lines throughout, but not a lot of variation of small details. I don't feel like there's any reflection hardly at all on this horn, except for right here. I don't really feel like that is a lot of information that we're seeing in here, whereas in this one, they're starting to pay attention to the line weight and the quality of the line to show things like this edge here on the inside is more important than this information out here on this side part where there's just all the little kind of bends and creases that are in the ballerina shoe. And then again, a heavier weighted one here, wider and weightier here as it indents and then comes back out. Gets thinner here and then thicker as it comes. Do you see how they're really paying attention to what they see as more noticeable or more important? And look at this area here, which is really a particularly beautiful area. You're seeing a lot of variation of line weight. Now this particular image not only has calligraphic lines, but it also has something called implied lines. Implied lines are like these lines that kind of start and then disappear but come back up and then come back and then disappear and come back up. That's how you use them in contour line. there's a lot of different types of implied lines, and you can read the article about it where I put that into your thing. But notice also that your eye is very attracted to the things that have more variation of line weight. And you can use that as a way to move your eye through the picture plane if you want. And so it's a clever way of doing that, whereas this just kind of feels all over and very integrated. It doesn't have a lot of that detailed of implied lines that are in here that show that there's some variation and weight differences that are happening. Look at the highlights. We really feel like this is a reflective object, and these are some of the highlights and shadows and reflections that we're seeing on this object, whereas here they just kind of feel graphically placed on here. They don't feel as real. Here you're seeing a close-up of a drawing from a student, and you're actually seeing implied lines being used, kind of dash lines being used to show the reflections that are in here. And then look at this area of the texture, the weightiness here. No texture as it moves in space should have its line weight stay the same. And they're really paying attention to that here, getting it lighter and implied where it's kind of dashed in here and then heavier again and closer together. Beautiful observation of this area here. Notice you're seeing those implied lines all throughout, all over the place in this particular piece. So here we're seeing again flat lines in your highlights and reflections when they're observing glass, and look how fake that looks. And then look here, and you're starting to notice that they're paying attention to their line weights and their kind of thicknesses of the lines, and whether it's calligraphic or tapering or whether it's implied, and they're really moving that, and these are starting to look like we're really seeing reflections in the bottles and stuff. So let's look at some glass. The thing that you want to think about, and this is really important that you pay attention in contour line drawing, is that no line should stay the same the whole way around an object. So here, if you're looking, do you see how this is a more obvious line, more noticeable, more obvious, and it gets a little less noticeable and then more noticeable and then less? Right there, it disappears completely, shows back up. Barely there, it's there, a little darker, more noticeable, more noticeable. You're trying to show what is noticeable and what is not noticeable. And when you draw it, you would draw all of these weird little linear shapes that you see in here, and you'd pay attention to how dark and how light they are and how noticeable they are and how obvious. Look at this highlight here. There's two. There's this one, and then there's a dark line between another one. And then look at this. This is actually a dark shape that you would put in with an implied line because it's not that noticeable. Notice that there's those dark shapes and those light shapes everywhere in here. If you notice that, that's going to make your glass look more real. So you want to pay attention to where your lines and edges are disappearing, for instance here, and where they show back up. That would be a great calligraphic line going across that. You want to pay attention to when you see a gradual soft value shape. You don't want to ask, what is that shape? You want to know that you saw it, you draw it. That's how you have to deal with it. Notice also that you don't see this top as obvious as you do this plastic piece, because this plastic piece is a different value. So that it goes without saying that these shapes are very noticeable of the wire, but notice that there's a dark shape in between that's just a dark line, and then this is a tapering line from thinner to darker as it goes around that area. You've got to pay attention to all those shapes like that, shapes within shapes. Remember, you're drawing in contour, which is a shape-based drawing. That means that you're looking for all the kind of weird little linear shapes in here and lines, but you're trying to show how noticeable, how obvious. You would not draw this line the same, and notice that that's tapering. Do you see that tapering? You would not draw that line the same as you would the line for the shape that's in here. This weird dark shape. I'm not asking what that is. I'm just going to draw it in there the way that I see it. Pay attention to this area here and the thickness of the glass. Pay attention to the lecture on glass and metal, because it'll help you to understand these last few things I'm going to talk about. Again, if you have cast shadows, you're not going to change, you're not going to do the line here in the cast shadow the same as when it gets out here, because it disappears. So this would be more implied and really thin, and this would be darker as it comes up, but not as dark as this edge of this glass, and especially not as dark as the edge of the glass right here, or here. So start to pay attention to where you see these noticeable highlights. Those are going to be darker lines. Where do you see these gradual gray things that you don't see as noticeably in the background, or this one, or even this one going across? Pay attention to the thickness of the glass. Look at these letters. These letters you don't write on your drawing. You draw the shape of what you're seeing, the little round dot that's there, the line that I see here, the kind of light line that's right there, the more noticeable line that's here, the shadow and highlight shape that's there. Some of these just disappear. The letters disappear completely and you don't notice them anymore. You draw that. Look at how this line goes through the bottle. Whoa, it doesn't even show up in the same place. It just goes right off of there. It's crazy talk. Look at this edge. This is noticeable, less noticeable as it comes down. Is that going to be as noticeable as this heavy dark line for this area here? Look at all these weird shapes that are in the cast shadow because we're seeing all these letters and reflections in them. The same with this spoon. You're not going to do this dark edge of the spoon the same as it comes in here. It has to change until it gets there. Then it's going to be darker. Then it's going to change again and be lighter. Then it's going to get much darker as it comes through here. You have to draw all of those changes because that's what's going to make your drawing really spectacular in contour drawing. So remember, look for the reflections. Is this really noticeable? Are these shapes more noticeable? Is this shape coming through the bottle as noticeable as, say, this edge would be right here? Or this darker spot, or the bottom of this? Notice also that you're seeing this reversed and in the inside back here. You're seeing the same thing that's right here on the plane reversed on the inside of this glass. Notice that you're seeing all these weird warbly things, and look at your apexes and naders, because what are they going to do? They're going to catch light reflection, and that's going to also change what you see going through the bottle. This line from this wall didn't stay the same as it went through there. And then notice the difference in how much more subtlety there is, and you're going to have a lot more implied lines and thinner lines in clear glass than you will ever have in metallics. Metallics have much more power. They have a lot more dramatic linear qualities in the shapes that you're going to be showing because they're very defined, very sharp, very obvious. So pay attention to any time you have any kind of a reflective object. You're going to see all your, here's the person right here doing a peace sign, it looks like, and there in the ball. I mean, you're seeing all, notice that they're curving with the ball. You don't see any just straight lines in here. They're curving with the ball everywhere that you go. Everything is changing with the ball. We can see this ball in this ball. We can see that ball in that ball. I can see that ball in that ball. It's like you're seeing all of these balls reflecting back and forth in front of one another. These are all going to be more noticeable lines than this is. Now you would indicate this with an implied very thin line. Do you see the shape of this darkness? Because this is what we call an open value, meaning that it's gradually changing, whereas these are very defined hard edges values, which are called closed values. You want to show that you noticed that in the thing that you draw. And the same with this one. This has a lot more soft line going across, not as sharp edges as some of the things in here because of the metal not being as reflective, but you're still seeing all of this stuff. Pay attention to what kind of quality of line you're going to be using to show all of these changes. And if it's a really noticeable line, then you're going to make that a more wide and darker line. If it's a less noticeable line, then you're going to probably make that an implied line. All right, let's look at these two drawings. So here, this is actually a really nice little drawing. It's missing a lot of the reflections in here and in here. It's kind of dead, but they've basically got the general information in here, but look how sketchy all of these lines are. You don't want sketchy line quality. You want controlled line quality. So even though this doesn't have as much what I call the second and third and fourth reflections, and in fact there's none in this glass whatsoever, the line quality that's controlled here is so much more beautiful than this is. So use good line quality as you go. Don't make your lines filled in shapes. This is all filled in shapes of darkness. Those are no longer about line. Those are about shapes themselves. Do not do this. Then another thing you need to pay attention to is this line right here, as you see on the outside, is never integrated to the inside. It's just an outline of that object. Whereas here, they've integrated this line by getting it thicker as it comes in and thinning out thicker as it comes in. Look at these lines that are more integrated. So you want to integrate your edges also. Look at this beautiful one right here. You have the calligraphic line on the back over here, and it's tapering and moving, and then it comes across here and it gets thicker as it comes across, and then it comes in here and just disappears into some of these implied lines that are in here. Pay attention to texture. It's not going to be the same all the way across. Don't symbolize it. And then pay attention also to your cast shadows being more implied, but getting thicker and darker and more noticeable as they come up in space. So pay attention to those kind of things. That's what a good tattoo artist, what a good graphic illustrator, what a graphic novelist, what an illustration artist does, what a regular artist does. Any artist of any kind who pays attention to line quality will make better work every single time. All right, that's all I have to say about calligraphic lines and implied lines.